Hi, I would like to warmly welcome our two panelists for today's session and our audience. So, the topic is fighting corruption and countering the closing of civic spaces in Sri Lanka. And this is a discussion where it's conducted by IYAP, International Youth Alliance of Peace. So, this is a discussion series that is initiated by them in line with the 9th December, the Anti-Corruption Day. So it's a youth-led organization in across South Asia, and they are doing peace building in Sri Lanka. And if you see in their page, you can see a lot of courses that they do and voluntary work. So this is also part of their initiative work. So for today's session, we have two awesome personalities, Ms. Tyagi Ruwanapatirana, regional researcher at Amnesty International Sri Lanka and South Asia. Tyagi has been involved in a lot of programs and a team member as well for IYAP. So thank you for that. And we have Ms. Shankita Gunaratna, Deputy Executive Director at Transparency International Sri Lanka. So today we are going to have a discussion, and I would like to open the floor for that. And Ms. Tyagi, I would like to have the discussion with you. And initially, I would like to address you with the question where there is corruption in civil spaces. And the most immediate and prominent effect of striking civic spaces is its association of declined respect of human rights, especially became significant after Piper Alagalaya in Sri Lanka. So, what's and how do you address the corruption that is seen in closing of civil spaces?
So you mean the reason for the government to shrink the civic space in this atmosphere, is it?
Yeah, because it started with the people Aragalaya, and currently we can see a lot of closing of civic spaces in Sri Lanka.
I would actually argue, that the civic space was anyway shrinking. I would say at least from the beginning of 2018 onwards, even during the Yahapalana time, because we saw how the ICCPR Act was being used against people like Shakti Prasad Kumara for Facebook comments, things like that. And I think it shrunk even further, especially after the Easter attacks in April 2019. And I think with the change of the government in November 2019, we saw the sort of almost a very rapid shrinking of the civic space. And that started with the arrests of CID officers who were conducting human rights investigations in the past, as well as, for instance, journalists being harassed who've had to leave the country and things like that. So that's the sort of context that was there even at the beginning of 2020. And that's way before the economic crisis really hit Sri Lanka and the people started feeling it. And so what we've seen is that, since Aragale, there was a lot of, momentum. There were thousands of people on the roads, and that was sustained over a period of, I don't know, say from like March to at least August. So that's a long period. But I think what's really affected the current shrinking civic space is the inordinate crackdown that we've seen, especially under the president Wickremesinghe, who has used a sort of multi-pronged approach. So not only has he used things like the draconian anti-terror law, the Prevention of Terrorism Act, but he's also used very sort of aggressive tactics. We've seen there's been attempts to put curfews. There's been attempts to try and declare high security zones. There's been at least three, and this was also before his time. There were about three emergency regulations that were put in place, and there were sort of mass arbitrary arrests of people who had entered the government buildings. And quite apart from all of that, we've just sort of almost habitually seen how the state crackdowns against dissent, especially when it comes to student union protests with the IUSF, and using things like rubber bullets, tear gas, water cannons. Those have almost become commonplace. I'll stop here for now.
Okay. You think it's the government is currently having closing of civic places? It's because of the actions that was happened during the Aragalaya that made them to do it, or as you said, it was happening, but they took it as an advantage in the event that happened, so they could, carry on their shrinking of civic spaces.
The way I see it, yes, the space was shrinking already, but I think it was taken to another level because also the kind of targets. Earlier, also the previous government was mostly targeting on minorities and critics. And what we're seeing now with August onwards, the crackdown is more on just any person who is a critic of government. So that's what's not being tolerated right now. And I think, yes, I mean it's you can definitely see it's not a coincidence that we don't see so many protests on the road right now, and that's because of these sort of fear tactics and retaliatory tactics and the reprisals against the protesters. So yeah, I would say we've seen an increase in that level of crackdown. Yeah.
Okay, agreed. Miss Shankita, next discussion topic would be, what do you think about right to information is hindered by countering the closing of civic spaces? So, a methodology as civil societies to overcome corruption in obtaining rightful information, especially in the civil society, specifically in Sri Lanka, there is always less access. What do you think about that?
You mean about the use of the right to information
Yeah.
to counter the reduction of civic space, is it?
Yeah.
Right. So if we look at the different tools that we can have against corruption, the right to information across the world remains at the forefront. It's one of the strongest tools that can be used to counter any form of corruption. Now, if we look at the reduction of civic space as corruption, let's roll back a little bit and look at the definition of corruption. Transparency International uses the definition that corruption is the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. So here we are talking about a context of a state which is being co-opted for private interests, whether it is a power grab, whether it is because people have vested interest, be it politicians or public servants, that our state is no longer acting fully representatively of the people. So then there appears to be some level of personal interest, of self-interest, of self-protection that is leading to this crackdown on civic space, right? So if we view that phenomenon as corruption, then we can then go to the question of how can the right to information be used to respond to that. Now, Tyagi mentioned the use of tear gas during the Aragalaya, for example. You would have seen before the RTI Commission, a journalist requested information about the tear gas that was used during the Aragalaya because there were widespread allegations about how expired or more potent tear gas was being used. And when this case came before the RTI Commission, the police actually, at that point, the point that I'm aware, refused to give information about the exact composition of the tear gas, but did say that the last date on which the tear gas canisters were purchased. And that helped establish that these were expired canisters. So now that is a specific instance of suppression of civic space through the quelling of protests, and how the right to information was used very creatively to counter the suppression of civic space. At the same time, you may be aware that there has been a long-standing move to look at revisiting the Voluntary Social Service Organizations Act to possibly increase control over civil society actors, voluntary organizations, non-governmental organizations. So in this space as well, there was quite a bit of struggle to find out what form this law was going to come in. Now, we know the right to information has been used in the past to access draft laws. We look at the Right to Information Act and the definition of what type of information people can have access to. The word draft laws, the phrase draft laws is specifically used in the definition of information. Now, this comes from a history of a legislative process in Sri Lanka that is extremely opaque. It gets very difficult if civil society or any citizen wants to contribute to a piece of law, or just review it and respond, or even object to a certain policy decision or a legal position that has been taken in an upcoming law. Things get very difficult. You try to go to the ministry, then you're told that it's with the legal drafts person, you're then told that it's with the Attorney General. It can be at any number of places. It could be presented in Parliament, the Cabinet. So it gets very difficult for people to access a draft law. So if you, so in that kind of context as well, if there is repressive legislation being brought, whether it is in relation to the voluntary social services organizations or any other law, the right to information can be used creatively to access such information. And we know there are at least 2 decisions before the Right to Information, where the Right to Information Commission has ordered disclosure. Actually, I can think of 3 examples. One is when Dr. Mario Gomez requested the draft disability rights law. It was originally rejected, stating that it is still in draft form. But then the commission ordered that it should be disclosed, which was a huge victory for that lobby. In the same way, the reparations law, when one citizen requested it, it was rejected, but then later on it was released on appeal. And recently, TISL requested the draft Microfinance Regulatory Act, which was then released to TISL. So that is also another space and another way in which the right to information can be used. As we know, the Right to Information Act can be used by any citizen to access information that is on record in the possession, custody, or control of any public authority. And the definition of a public authority is quite wide. It basically encompasses any organization that does a public service or a public activity. And to the extent of that activity, we can file right to information requests. But of course, we should be careful not to ask open-ended questions, but to ask for specific information that is on record. So even on this issue of the suppression of civic space, the right to information can be a very potent tool, being one of the strongest tools in the anti-corruption toolkit. I'll stop there for a moment.
Okay. So as the moderator today, even I was I'm part of IYAP. I'm following the course under their democracy and governance and anti-corruption. So as a background, my background is as an entrepreneur, so I never had about knowledge about this. So learning through the course and the content and the precise lectures, I felt like because it was not in the education, like even from ground level. So a lot of people don't know what kind of information they are to gain. So, and when it's getting more like shrinking in Sri Lankan atmosphere, it's more hard for them even to have an idea on what's going in the country as a democratic country. So that's something I would say very much of a corruption in the Sri Lankan atmosphere. So it's about right for information plus the knowledge in regarding to that. So, Ms. Tyagi, so the next question is countering the closing of civic spaces in Sri Lanka in comparison to the South Asian region. So, because you are working in South Asia with other countries as well, so I think you have a broader knowledge on this.
Yeah. So I wouldn't rank it, but I will, because in at different times, different countries have different ways of cracking down on protests. So the intensity heightens and it goes down at certain times. So I could just give you just like a basic overview. India, of course, has always, I would say, cracked down on civic space in the recent past. We've seen how, I mean, for example, Amnesty's own office in India has been shut down, not just ours. Greenpeace has been shut down. I know several international organizations have been facing difficulty to operate there, and that, of course, affects the freedom of association. And this is through a act called the Foreign Contributions Regulations Act that bars foreign funding from coming in for NGOs. So that has been used as a way to stop international, or rather NGOs, from getting donor money to operate. And we're worried that this might be a model that the VSSO Act's amendment will look at as well. So that's just in terms of India. And of course, it's happening in a wider context of the conflict in Kashmir, the fact that there's a lot of anti-Muslim violence and that anti-Muslim sentiment that's been rising, especially under Modi's government. Then if you look at Pakistan, I think there's been a very vibrant civic resistance or movement for a long time. But of course, that has been cracked down on, and there it's by the deep state, essentially, which is the intelligence services of Pakistan, because a lot of, even though it's a democratically elected government, a lot of the strings are effectively pulled by the military. And to be able to stay in power in Pakistan, you need to be sort of, okay with the military, essentially. And of course, that's a country where we're still talking about extrajudicial killings, targeted killings like that. We've seen a case of a recent journalist as well who was executed, who had been killed in Kenya, and we're trying to figure out whether that had anything to do with his work. And then, of course, enforced disappearances is still a very daily reality in Pakistan. And then if you look at Bangladesh, for example, they have something called the Digital Security Act, which is slightly similar the way and manner it's used, like in Sri Lanka with but there the focus is mostly on online comment and criticism of the government. So, I mean, if you look, and of course, Afghanistan is a completely, different ballgame altogether, because now under the Taliban, the minorities like the Hazaras and also women in particular can't say anything critical of the Taliban without fearing reprisals. And we hear about attacks and targeted killings almost on a weekly basis. So that's sort of the context. So I think if you look at it in terms of the region, this is a big problem, shrinking civic space. And it's why we keep monitoring it as much as we can.
Okay. So I would like if audience, like y'all can comment, y'all can ask your questions of the discussing right now, because there's a comment section, so y'all can give your opinions as well. So Ms. Sankita, transparent, accountable, and participating governance in Sri Lanka against corruption. What's your opinion in related to that?
Yes, thanks. So, transparency can generally be seen as an antidote to corruption, because where there is light, it's a little difficult to hide things, right? So, it's just based on that simple context, simple concept. So that is why, even as an organization and in general, it helps to have more information available. You referred to the fact that we don't know what's going on in the country. The more we don't know, the less we can actually contribute to a country's governance. So it would help. So I mean, I use the example, even forgetting governance in terms of our day-to-day decisions during the fuel crisis. I mean, we're still going through a crisis, but at the point when citizens were queuing up for days on end to get fuel, if we only knew exactly when the fuel was going to arrive, how much was available to citizens, then we would have been able to be a little more organized and also, in a sense, stop disrupting governance, right? So the more information we have, the easier it becomes for citizens to function in their day-to-day lives. But in addition to that, if we know, for example, when public procurement is happening, when I say procurement, what I mean is a public tendering process where a government purchases goods, services, or works. So they say they need to build a road, right? Or need to build some kind of public service like a monorail. So at that point of time, if we know what the government exactly requires, and then we know what the specifications are, who applied for that particular tender, who was selected, why they were selected, on what basis, and then how long it took for them to get selected, how much they were paid, how much um, how much of the work did they do according to the original specifications? Did they successfully complete the project? Right? Were there lots of change requests? Right? If we know all of that information, it gets a lot easier for us to detect when corruption happens. So transparency really it does act as an antidote to corruption and helps accountability. Now, what is accountability? Accountability is when a person, somebody who wields power or holds power in trust and is supposed to do something for somebody else, actually ensures that they're doing what they're supposed to do. They're doing what is expected of them in the public interest. So that is what your the power that is vested in you is used in the best interest of the public. So transparency also leads the way to accountability. Now, you also mentioned public participation. Why is public participation important? Now, recently you would have seen that there was an anti-corruption bill that was presented by the government. That is a new law that is supposed to bring together three existing anti-corruption laws. Now, during the Aragalaya and before that and after that, I mean, if we are in a post-Aragalaya world, even after that, citizens have shown that they're very interested in the issue of corruption. So, when a new law is being brought to the forefront or brought into parliament or being proposed by the government to deal with the issue of anti-corruption, isn't it important for the public to know that whether that bill is actually, or that law is responsive to all the demands that the people were making on the streets, right? So it's really important for citizens to be able to participate in that process so that they can ensure that the law that comes in at the end or is passed at the end is something that they're satisfied with. So, and it represents the views of the general public, because when we give power to public officials by paying them through our tax money, when we give power to our public representatives, to our politicians by voting for them, what we do is we vest our sovereignty, we give our sovereignty to them to use on a condition, and that condition is that they use it in our best interest. So then, for us to be able to know that they're using it in our best interest, they need to allow us in to that space so that we can participate in that process. So that was just, the anti-corruption bill was just an example, but in any forum, it's important for there to be participation, and participation should come from diverse stakeholders. There should be women, there should be youth, there should be disabled persons, so that we ensure that governance is really responsive to the needs of the people and not just of the majority, but of all people. right? Because government is not supposed to represent just those who elected them, but they're supposed to respond to and represent everybody in the country. And that's what we mean by the best interest, the public interest. So if we bring this all back to the issue of corruption, so transparency, accountability, and public participation are key principles of this idea of open government, right? You govern in an open way so that you minimize the risk of corruption. Now, we're talking in Sri Lanka about a context of widespread corruption. Even as I speak today, I know people are thinking, I know you're thinking, she's talking about things, she's talking about a dream, right? We can't stop corruption in this country. So we're talking about a really beleaguered country where corruption prevails and everything else has to bend down to corruption. So in order to be able to stop this, we have to act in the long term and in the short term to take the necessary steps to incorporate these principles of transparency, accountability, and public participation. So it seems a little daunting. It's tiring in the short term to keep doing these things, but we know people who have been campaigning for years, those that went before us, those that even those that are parallel to us will know that change doesn't happen immediately, right? So it comes in waves, it comes over the long term. So each specific action that we take in the short term really makes a difference. Even if you look at the Aragalaya, people think that, okay, did the Aragalaya fail? Right? But I don't think it fails if you look at it in the grand scheme of the issue of corruption, for example, that in itself was a way of people participating in governance. People actually saying, we've had enough, right? People saying, we are dissatisfied, we're completely dissatisfied with the way that we're being governed. So that is people taking back that sovereignty and participating. That is people demanding accountability, and that is people calling out corruption. So all of these principles are important and need to come together in order for us to be able to, in the long term, fight corruption. But the short term steps need to be taken by each of us today. Stop.
Like as Tyagi said, like shrinking of civic spaces was happening throughout, and it's more or less increasing. What's your like opinion related to anti-corruption? Like it was happening like in the past as well as in Sri Lanka. So you think there is an increase or decrease after Aragalaya, or it's continuously still in the high like the gradient is high, accelerating?
You mean anti-corruption action by citizens?
Yeah.
Okay, so I think there was a definite uptick in citizen activism during that time. In citizen activism during Aragalaya, because I mean, from our own perspective, we've been talking about this for a while, but what we realized was that citizen awareness in the long term had helped citizens to understand, kind of digest these concepts, but the Aragalaya gave it a space to actually be localized, for it to come out in unison, not even one voice, in multiple voices, on multiple causes. So because of the Aragalaya and that kind of coming together of all these people, there has definitely been an uptick in people who are interested in the issue of anti-corruption. Even we find that diverse stakeholders from across the world have begun to talk to us about this issue, and that is great. Because even as TI Sri Lanka, a concern that we had in the long term, I mean, this year is our 20th year in Sri Lanka, we'd always been concerned that the youth don't care, but this has proven that wrong. That if the youth are pushed to the brim, they will take action. I know the Aragalaya was not just youth, even though it is cast that way, but there has been an increase in the interest in anti-corruption. So I think the role that all of us need to play is to equip the youth to be able to use that in this context of widespread systemic corruption, so that everyone feels supported. Each of those persons feels that there is a point to fighting this, because as long as you're alone, it becomes a really uphill battle. But if collectively everyone feels like the other is resisting corruption and is fighting corruption, then the chance of success becomes greater. So I think that is really important, and to give people the tools and the knowledge necessary to be able to, and the courage, of course, to be able to fight corruption.
Great. So, Ms. Tyagi, corruption and human rights in Sri Lankan scope that is more visible in public and private sector.
So basically, you're asking what I think about it, or so. I mean, we look at
Yeah, you can use in Sri Lanka because you all are a research entity. So, what kind of things that you all think about the private and the public sector corruption in human rights?
Okay, so I mean, corruption in human rights, or do you mean corruption as how it relates to human rights?
A corruption that relates to human rights.
Yeah. So, I mean, we haven't worked on, we don't actually work on corruption as a sort of a thematic area like, TISL is really the lead in this work. We look at corruption a little bit as an organization in terms of how it affects human rights. So, the way we look at it is generally how, for example, when the state has a positive obligation to provide, say, for example, economic, social, cultural rights, right to health, right to education, and things like that, which obviously has a cost implication, how corruption gets in the way of that. Basically, that this is money or government revenue that could have been spent on the progressive realization of economic, social, cultural rights, or even civil political rights, that is sort of now sidelined because that money is benefiting someone personally. So that's how we look at it. In the private sphere, we don't really comment on it because, in a way, the state system is technically supposed to be able to deal with it with the kind of institutions and the judiciary and the prosecutions systems. So the way we look at it is mostly targeting government in the little way we do, but as I said, not in the capacity or the way that TISL does.
Okay. Can Ms. Sankita add to that point?
Yeah. So, just if you look at this recent case that TISL has filed, TISL actually has gone to court on the issue of the economic crisis, stating that the decisions that were taken in relation to the economy that led to the kind of crisis that Sri Lanka is going through actually violates the fundamental rights of the Sri Lankan citizens, and this is a case that we are filing in the public interest. Now, we have alleged this before the Supreme Court. So, what we're saying there is that the high-level decisions that were made to, for example, to delay going to the IMF for assistance, the decision to peg the dollar at 203 rupees, the decision to make corporate tax cuts. So all of these decisions that were made at a very high level, it is quite unclear. So this is where right to information also becomes quite relevant. It's quite unclear whether the decisions were actually made in the public interest. And as a result of these decisions, we're finding that people were dying in petrol queues and fuel queues. So, in a sense, not in a sense, it actually affects if the decisions were illegally or wrongfully made, then those decisions have led to those rights violations, leading to people being treated unequally, them not being able to exercise or enjoy their right to life, which is not a fundamental right, but it is generally recognized as a human right, and their right to security. So, in that sense, these high-level decisions, if they are made in the personal interest, using the definition of corruption, and not in the public interest, it can lead to human rights violations. So that case is an example of that. And relating that to the right to information, that is also a violation that we have alleged in that case. And by now, the Supreme Court has uh, provided leave to proceed, granted leave to proceed on this case, where basically that is an acknowledgement by the Supreme Court that there is enough for the court to go into a little bit more detail. And the court has actually ordered the Auditor General to provide all information that led to those decisions, communications between the Monetary Board, the central bank, etc., for all of that information to be provided to the Supreme Court, which was supposed to be provided by yesterday, the 30th of November, so that the Supreme Court can look into this matter further. So that is an interaction between alleged corruption and alleged human rights violations, where you can make that connection. And in the same way, if you look at even the general understanding of corruption, not about high-level decision making, whether that was making the public interest, but if you look at things like tender-related corruption, procurement-related corruption, if a if a tender is awarded to a person who is not qualified to do the particular job, then that means that the product that will be given to the public with this, say it's a hospital, right? That will be faulty. It will have less quality. We will have spent more on it. So if you uh, bear that out a little bit more, that means that the roof could collapse. I mean, this has happened. The roof of a hospital can collapse on a patient, right? It could mean that you spent further money on repairing a hospital that could have gone to essential healthcare or education. So, in all these ways, you're violating human rights through acts of corruption. So, that's just the thing.
So the next topic in the panel discussion, it would be addressing Ms. Tiage as well. This whole series is an initiative of IYAP, International Youth Alliance for Peace, and in align with the Anti-Corruption Day and Human Rights Day. So the question is, 10th of December is World Human Rights Day in significance with the celebration. Comparing to the international scope, where do you see human rights in Sri Lanka?
I mean, it's similar to what I said before, in that it's hard to say, we don't do a ranking system. And I must admit, just a few weeks ago, there was a news organization that got in touch and asked, why is Amnesty focused so much on Sri Lanka? And the only sort of answer we have to that is that, it really depends on the kind of researchers' capacities, the priorities that have been sort of, identified for each region, because we operate from 18 regional offices around the world. So we don't really have a sort of hierarchy or like a ranking system like, the other organizations do, for example, where we stand on journalists, human rights, and freedom of expression, things like that. But I think Sri Lanka, especially, we've been in a constant state of crisis, I would say, for the last 3 years, and then even before that as well. There was a constitutional coup, there was the Easter attacks, and then the kind of crackdown on the Muslim community. And after that, then the COVID restrictions and how that affected human rights as well, especially migrant workers and garment sector workers. And then also now with the economic crisis linked to the political crisis, also there's a lot of crackdown, especially on criticism and dissent, freedom of expression, freedom of peaceful assembly, things like that. So yeah, I mean, we do an annual report where we look at each country's human rights record. And I would say Sri Lanka is pretty concerning, also because, I say that because of the kind of propensity or like the likelihood of it going in a sort of a, violent conflict linked to these things. We know that, even though the law ended 30 years ago, there are lingering issues to this day. Mothers that disappeared are still waiting for answers. There are renewed fears of land grabs, especially in the north. There are, conversations happening now about the devolution of power and, whether the 13th Amendment to the Constitution would be implemented. So those kind of frustrations have always been there, and it still hasn't been resolved. And whether it would lead to something new, that's sort of, something we need to keep an eye out. But at the same time, on top of all of those things, new violations have been happening, especially, I mean, just over this year. I mean, all of us are sort of aware of the kind of human rights violations we've seen. And I think what we are seeing, though, is a greater level of empathy from the public on, say, for example, the Prevention of Terrorism Act. For a very long time, this is a law that came up in as a temporary provision in 1949, not 1969, and then, sorry, basically 40 years ago, 1979. And then after that, it's become a permanent tool that consecutive governments have been using against critics, minorities. And now, um, the public generally saw it as something that the Tamils were affected with, or after 2019, the Muslims were affected by. But now it's suddenly like, oh, but why are you using the PTA against Putulige and Siridamatero and Hasham Jivanta? So I think that there's this sort of renewed interest and an awakening of your civic consciousness in a way, which is interesting. And I think people like Sankita also said, there are more in corruption issues now, even though people may have been willing to give like a pass on it earlier. Now we've realized how much of that has impacted our own lives. So yeah, I mean, the human rights situation, it's just very volatile, so it's difficult to say. But we will put out, obviously, our annual human rights report next year, which will look at some of the stuff that I mentioned already, because the draft has gone in. Thanks.
Okay. So, according to the research, like from in South Asia, I'm not, I know, like there is no ranking, but for the general idea, like where, again, it's not the ranking, like the general idea, where do we settle as a country, like from the Asian countries?
So I'll speak on South Asia. I think I would say, okay, the biggest one is, of course, Afghanistan, I think, since Kabul fell on the 15th of August last year. And since then, there's been, a sort of renewed violence against the people by the Taliban this time. And not that it stopped ever, but so that's almost like a sort of like a crisis situation still. So I think the kind of way we look at that is very different to how we look at Sri Lanka or even Nepal or even Maldives. And I think, given the number of people and the kind of regional powers, I think India is still a big one as well. Especially with regards to the rights of Muslims. We've seen the CAA that was passed a few years ago, and how the impacts of that is slowly sort of being absorbed by the people and how they're reacting. Pakistan, again, also a big one. So I wouldn't compare Sri Lanka against India or Pakistan, and definitely not against Afghanistan. Maybe if I were given to rank, I would say we are like about the fourth, like after Afghanistan, India, Pakistan, and yeah, Sri Lanka.
So, despite of the population in all those countries and whatever they are going through, so we are in a higher scale, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's relative, but no, I wouldn't say it's bigger than Afghanistan. I think that's a bigger, huge human rights crisis. And of course, even in Bangladesh, the Rohingya crisis and the kind of fallout of that, that's still ongoing. So there are critical human rights issues in each of the countries, which is what makes it difficult to rank. But I think our human rights violations, to an extent, don't come in a conflict setting, like in the sense it's not an active armed walk on conflict. So that's the difference I would make. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So, Ms. Ankita, so 9th of December is again the Anti-Corruption Day, and if I would want to have the discussion in related to the international platform, like anti-corruption in international scope, and where do you see Sri Lanka in that context?
So, as you might already be aware, there is something called the Corruption Perceptions Index that Transparency International actually carries out every year, which looks at public sector corruption in the world. It's not an assessment of all corruption, it's about public sector corruption. And it is a corruption perceptions index, it's not a corruption index, right? So, because corruption usually happens in the shadows, it it's very difficult to measure the actual extent of it, because usually if you look at a bribe or something like that, the giver and the taker both will be part of the corruption, so they won't generally talk about it, right? So that's why corruption is measured as a perception, based on perception. So in the Corruption Perceptions Index, the 2021 score, Sri Lanka is at 37 out of 100. So that is not a good score at all, as you can imagine. And in terms of ranking, Sri Lanka is at a rank 102 out of 180 countries and territories. Again, not a great ranking. But this is not new. Sri Lanka has been stagnating around that level for the past 10 years, actually. So the Corruption Perceptions Index is not a very good measure of how Sri Lanka is doing vis-a-vis other countries. But if we look at Sri Lanka on its own, we can clearly see that there is a lot of corruption happening. And TI Sri Lanka has begun asking the question whether Sri Lanka is actually a captured state. Now, state capture is when a state's institutions, its laws, its policies, and decisions are made in the interest of a few and not in the public interest, right? So, what we saw through the Aragalaya and through the different lawmaking processes that we're seeing also actually begs the question of whether Sri Lanka is a captured state. And we can see this in many things. Like we saw the sugar scam, for example. When the sugar scam happened, what we saw was that different tax rates were gazetted in the interest of allies of certain people, uh, just just to give them an advantage. There are other examples of things like this happening. So then, if we are a captured state, that really puts a different kind of look on things. Where can we say that we truly have accountability? Is our parliament acting in the interest of the people? Is our executive acting in the interest of the people? People are also beginning to question our law enforcement authorities. We know there have been an entire spate of cases that anti-corruption or corruption cases that have been filed in the past few years relating to um, prominent political figures that have been dropped either due to technical errors or due to the alleged lack of evidence. So then that begs the question of whether Sri Lanka's judiciary perhaps um, uh, doesn't really I mean, it's very difficult to make that call, but people have begun to ask that question, and also about law enforcement authorities. So then it becomes very difficult for us to really seek accountability on the question of corruption in Sri Lanka. And as I said, we are all, the citizens of Sri Lanka, beginning to feel frustrated about it. And that's why it becomes all the more important for us to do whatever possible to ensure that our law enforcement authorities are independent, Commissions are independent from the executive. We have people in power that have integrity, that are accountable, that are willing to make their asset declarations public, for example, to who are willing to actually make public where they're getting their money for election campaigns from, so that we know who's on whose behalf they're acting once they actually get elected. So it's a wide plethora of things that we really need to work on. But this is the thing, right? So with the Aragalaya, we saw a huge number of issues come to the forefront, ranging from the executive presidency to the public service to disappearances to estate workers' rights. So it was a very, you know, interesting, useful, valuable way of bringing these issues to the forefront, coming from different quarters. But now is where the work has to happen. And I think the youth also have a role to play, because it's difficult when it all comes out in the cold light of day and you have to make these decisions, policy decisions of what is the best solution. It's easy to sometimes point fingers, but it's also hard to come up with the solutions. So now is when we actually have to get together, put our heads together, and work on these things, keep pushing for accountability on all fronts. And it doesn't always have to be a fight. It could be as simple as resisting corruption in our own lives. I know there is a cost to resisting corruption in Sri Lanka, but it remains our province and our duty to do what we can within our spheres of influence. So I think because we're speaking to the youth here as well, it's important to know when we are enabling corruption and to stop that. It's important to call out corruption. It's important to stop contributing to corruption. And then it's important to actually take action wherever we can get organized. And sometimes the decisions are with us. When we vote, the decision is with us, right? So it's important that we take these decisions seriously, and of course, like, make the right decision so that we can also hold our head up high later on, right? And also do what exactly what you're doing right now, which is to educate the public, educate everyone, so that we can actually call it out when it happens, and uh, contribute, make a contribution. We can't individually fight corruption, but make the best possible contribution to fighting corruption. So, with this year's Anti Corruption Day as well, I hope there is a space to have that conversation further and contribute to that conversation.
What's your perception on the national policies in Sri Lanka for this whole corruption and the execution, fighting for that? So the current policies and the execution level that is happening in Sri Lanka in a sphere that is safe for the civil society?
If you take Sri Lanka's anti-corruption laws, we have enough laws to prosecute offenders. We do, right? We need
And the
to
level of execution?
Yeah, that's the thing. So if we are hiding behind the need for new laws, that is not necessary, and we don't need to believe that, because we have enough laws to prosecute offenders if we wanted to. So the lapse does seem to be in execution, as you mentioned, in law enforcement. So for law enforcement to be able to function, they need to be independent, which means whatever law enforcement authority, the appointment has to be made independently. Removal shouldn't be too easy. They need to be paid adequately, right? So there has to be security of tenure. So these are the markers of independence usually, and we should leave no space for interference, political or otherwise. Then, in addition to that, we have to ensure that adequate resourcing is given and adequate expertise is given. Now, we saw anti-corruption courts, or what is loosely known as anti-corruption courts or financial courts, were set up, I think, in 2018 in Sri Lanka. But what has happened to any of the cases that went there? We know that criminals have the best defense usually. They have the best attorneys, they have the best financial advisors. So we need to equip our law enforcement to be able to operate at global standards. We talk about the conversation on international asset recovery, whether there has been money that has been stolen from Sri Lanka and expatriated. Now, imagine having to trace through a banking system of international financial system money that has been taken out of Sri Lanka, money that has been illegally obtained. It's a very difficult technical process. So we need to also have that expertise in place. So for all of this, we need political will as well. So which is what brings us back to the question of what is within our control. Who we appoint as our representatives, we need to know that they're acting in our best interest, in the public's interest, in order for us to be able to do all of these things. And where that fails, I think even between elections, citizens need to uh, be alive to what is going on in governance and take action where necessary. It could be as simple as filing a right to information request, or it could be that you take to the streets in protest if you're unhappy with the way in which you're being governed.
Can
So,
I just add that as
yeah.
well? And I think, yeah, Sankita was talking about sort of being sort of vigilant about the kind of law reform initiatives coming up. And I think the 21st Amendment is a good example here because, it came almost on the back of so much public demand for the executive presidency to be abolished. But how far did it go? I feel like this was such a opportune moment to get change, but what we got was a like nothing even closely, remotely close to abolishing the executive presidency. There was a lot of talk and demand for independent institutions to be actually independent, and that requires an independent appointment system and the kind of body that makes these appointments, which is the Constitutional Council, to be independent. But this 21st Amendment, what it did was ultimately they made sure that the people making those recommendations to appointments to the independent commissions were the majority of them were people aligned with government. So you can't expect independent institutions, which are supposed to have this sort of role of being a check on governance, to effectively operate if it's sort of aligned with government. So this is kind of the thing. I think it's also up to the people to understand and read the fine print. And just because the politicians have said, yes, we've heard your demands, and here you are, the 21st Amendment, we shouldn't sort of be willing to just take that, because that you should always scrutinize it a little bit more, and then try and read the small print to see if it actually addresses the concerns that have been raised by the protest, and most of this which led to the crisis in the first place.
I would say like we had come to the conclusion of the panel discussion, and for the audience, I would say it would have been a very um, current topic oriented discussion because Ms. Tyagi and Ms. Ankita was addressing the current issues and the scope of Sri Lanka in representing youth, a young two panelists. So thank you, Ms. Tyagi, and thank you, Zankita, for contributing your time and your knowledge and the awareness that you shared with us today in this platform. So, IYAP, thank you for initiating this. And as Ms. Sangeeta said, she would also would like to join for more discussions like this, and Ms. Tyagi would also join. So, I think for the audience, if I don't see anybody has raised any questions, uh, so I think thank you both of you for joining us, and we would conclude the session for today. Thank you.
Thank you. Good
Thank you,
night.